Hello, class. We're moving on with the second part of Lesson 11, War on the Home Front. What we're talking about in this lesson is life in America during and after World War II. On the left, we have a piece of propaganda with the slogan during the war effort, it can happen here unless we keep them firing. And that slogan was, unless we keep them firing, to try to keep people behind the war effort to build up the war industries. And then on the right is the iconic photo from Life magazine of the Victory in Japan Day in Times Square, the sailor kissing the nurse. So the United States' success in World War II required the total commitment of the nation's resources. On the home front, public education, mass media all promoted nationalism. So on the bottom left, we have a public school class or public group of public school students eating lunch. There in the middle, the main medium during this era was the radio. Obviously, we talked before about Roosevelt's fireside chats. The government and President Roosevelt kept the country up to speed on the war effort. There was also films, but at this period of time, the television had just been invented, and not everyone owned a television at this point, so people were still using the radio. A lot of people did go to the movie theater to check out films related to the war effort and other propaganda. And then here on the right, we have a woman that would have been part of the women's ordinance that we discussed previously in the first part of lesson 11. A couple of pieces of propaganda that sort of stick with me. I pulled these two because they really play on every part of the emotions that propaganda are supposed to play on: your fears, your conscience, your sort of like it's a blend of making you scared and guilty all at the same time. So when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. That was related to the gas rationing that was going on in the era. And then on the right, don't let that shadow touch them. And it's got the Nazi insignia, swastika in the shadows. And these children are sort of huddled together. And what they're encouraging you to do is to buy war bonds during the war effort. The efforts of the United States to organize and distribute its resources to achieve victory during World War II was a massive overtaking. So economic resources were obtained through really every part of the American economy. The U.S. government and industry forged close working relationships to allocate resources effectively. This also leads to the higher rate of wages, more rights and opportunity for unions during the war as well. Rationing was used to maintain a supply of essential products to the war effort, so everything from butter to leather to gasoline was rationed. War bonds and the income tax were used for financing the war. War bonds have been around since the Civil War. Income tax had been around since the Civil War, but now things changed because we already learned about the 16th Amendment. That was an amendment to allow for a graduated income tax. Now we have a payroll income tax that comes available during World War II, and it never leaves us. We still are bound by a payroll income tax in the post-war World War II era to this day. Business was retooled from peacetime to wartime production. So a really great example would be Ford. They start manufacturing tanks and planes and jeeps and trucks in preparation for World War II and throughout. This is a $200 war bond that had President Roosevelt's likeness on it. On the left, we have a gas ration book. And on the right, this is a very unpopular outfit during World War II and one that was largely banned. It's called a zoot suit because it didn't ration enough fabric, and it actually led to what were called the zoot suit riots in Los Angeles during the war that was sparked between Navy sailors and a group of Mexican Americans that were wearing zoot suits during the war and during this period of time where that outfit fell out of fashion. Human resources, more women and minorities entered the job force as men entered the armed forces. And obviously, women and minorities are going to serve in some combat roles. We'll have women who will go in as aviators and African Americans who will serve in non-combat roles and in combat roles, as I mentioned before, for everything from infantry to artillery to aviation. Citizens volunteered in support of the war effort. Victory gardens, as we see on the bottom left, were popular rationing campaigns. There in the middle, we have the Norman Rockwell version of Rosie the Riveter, which was pretty famous during this era. I love this particular drawing. She's got her campaign buttons on, and she's got her lunchbox, and she's got her rivet gun, and she's standing on a copy of Mein Kampf. And then a very famous American, Private Joe Louis, says, we're going to do our part, and we'll win because we're on God's side. Joe Louis was a heavyweight boxing champion. Military resources, the draft and selective service was used to provide personnel for the military. As we learned in Lesson 10, the peacetime draft started in 1940. The GI Bill was passed to help soldiers pay for college and also to pay for home loans when they returned from service. This was known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It was instrumental in providing soldiers with an opportunity to get on their feet when they returned from war. A big proponent of that was the wartime correspondent Ernie Pyle that we learned about in Lesson 10. And then, of course, the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, was run by William Donovan, and it was our anti-espionage department. And this organization became the forerunner to the post-war CIA. So here we have the selective service, and then that's what a draft card looked like during this era. Contributions to a war effort come from all segments of society. Women entered into previously male job roles as African Americans and others continued to struggle to obtain desegregation and the continued fight against Jim Crow and an attempt to bring about discriminatory hiring practices. Both women, African Americans, and other minorities went to work in the millions during the war effort. And here we have women working in a munitions factory. It's what my grandmother did during the war. And then we have this African American with a rivet gun working on the right. The contributions of women during World War II, women increasingly participated in the workforce to replace men serving in the military, everything from agriculture to industry. And that's why Rosie the Riveter here became the symbol of women in the labor force. And women typically participated in non-combat military roles, but there were occasions where women did wind up in combat, but it was rare. The contributions of African Americans during World War II, African Americans migrated to cities in search of jobs in war plants, cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh. They campaigned for victory in war and equality at home. This particular effort was led by A. Philip Randolph, who led the Double V campaign, victory in war and victory at home, to bring about an end to Jim Crow. And here we have a mass protest of members of the NAACP that says, race discrimination breeds fascism. Prejudice coupled with wartime fears can also affect the civil liberties of minorities, and that definitely was the case during World War II toward the treatment of Japanese Americans. This occurred not long after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and this led to the widespread internment of Japanese Americans from 1942 to 1945. There was a strong anti-Japanese prejudice on the West Coast and throughout the country, and the false belief that Japanese Americans were aiding the enemy heightened that response. So here we have Japanese Americans, children on the left, and families on the right that were forced out of their homes and businesses and were moved into internment camps that popped up all over the West Coast. The internment of Japanese Americans continued. Japanese Americans were relocated to internment camps as a result of Franklin D. Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. The internment affected Japanese American populations along the West Coast, many of which lost everything, their private property and their personal possessions. The Supreme Court upheld the government's right to act against Japanese Americans living on the West Coast in the United States in the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. Later, a public apology was eventually issued by the U.S. government, and financial retribution was made to survivors during the Reagan administration, and that continued all the way through the Clinton administration. Suggested reading that I have for you all would be Farewell to Manzanar. It's an incredible read. Very quick read as well. So here on the left, top left, we can see the vast number of internment camps. On the right, we have Japanese Americans that are being processed in the internment camps. Here's a map of all the internment camps that existed during the war, and then you can just see the racist sentiment that was going on during the war here on the bottom right. So during World War II, the media and entertainment industries saw their role as supporting the war effort by promoting nationalism. This led to the creation of the Office of War Information, the OWI, that was established as the country's propaganda machine. So everybody from Walt Disney to Dr. Seuss was involved in producing propaganda during World War II. This is a cartoon of Donald Duck as a Nazi. It's called Der Fuhrer's Face. I would highly recommend you check it out. It's basically the premise is Donald Duck is having this nightmare that he's a Nazi, and he wakes up to find out that it was all a dream and he's truly an American. So how the media and communication elements assisted the Allied efforts during World War II. The U.S. government maintained strict censorship of reporting the war. Public morale and ad campaigns kept Americans focused on the war effort, raising money for bonds, etc. And the entertainment industry produced movies, plays, and shows that boosted morale and patriotic support for the war effort, as well as portrayed the enemy in stereotypical ways. This also leads to the creation of the USO, the United Service Organization, as well. So here on the left, we have a propaganda piece. It says, "Censored, let's censor our conversation about the war." My grandparents' letters that went back and forth during the war were constantly censored. And then on the right here, "Wanted for murder, her careless talk costs lives." Just sort of a sexist piece of propaganda to sort of insinuate that her gossip ultimately led to the death of American service members. Here we have the National War Finance Committee that was connected to the OWI, presenting free movies about the war effort. And then we have another OWI slogan, or poster with the slogan, "We will if we keep them firing." And this is a little bit of a play on words. It's a little bit of a pun. Let's catch him with his panzers down. Obviously, panzers were tanks. And it says, "We will if we keep them firing." So this is where we're going to stop for today. We'll move on into the third part of the lesson and deal with the Holocaust in the last portion of Lesson 11. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much.